So like, now I know I need to take the time off. What do I do? What kind of help do I get? And then if I'm ready to go back to work, how do I know that I'm ready? And how do I
Yes.
make sure it doesn't happen again? Because I think this is a very new concept, I think, at least in the environment that we're operating in. I remember starting to hear this concept of I'm taking a mental health day. Start to see that, okay, they've accepted that this is part of the reality. It's fine, it's valid, it's acknowledged. And here's what we can do about it. And that's really nice to see when you get to be a part of that journey with organizations where you see the shift, right? From where
That
we
is
started.
excellent. Very warm welcome to you. Today we are going to talk about how to transform doubt and fear into confidence and security. And I'm so happy and pleased that today joins me Karina Schneider. Very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'm so happy you're here because you are going to let us into the secrets of how to actually boost confidence after, let's call it like that, after a break that a professional leader might have taken for his or her mental health. So you are actually, Karina, you are a professional mental health transformation coach. You actually help individuals boost confidence and get back to professional life after. Dive right in. What are the common challenges that professionals face, or what are challenges, typical examples that people decide, okay, I will take a break here because it's better for my mental health?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alex, that we have this space to talk about this, because I think it's not often openly spoken about. And that's where the experience of fear and insecurity comes from, because people don't know what to expect when they decide to take time out of work because of their mental health. Now, to be very specific, many of this shows up in terms of burnout. That's one of the top reasons why people take time off work. It's not the only reason, but at least from my experience, that's usually the context that these conversations happen.
And also, if I may add, it's one that it starting to get less of a taboo, because this is something important I want to underline actually for our dear viewers. We are on a mission here, right? I mean, I guess what I see from your work, you're on a mission here to de-taboo this thing of mental health. Mental health, first of all, is nothing negative. It's actually something positive to look after ourselves and to do self-care, right? And so the fact that people start to talk more about burnout is already a positive sign, because we should not tabooize this, right?
Yes, and I think we've seen that this, in a way has become a reality that a lot of organizations have faced, many families have faced. And so I think the benefit of this being a bit more open and transparent is that it makes it easier for people to access support, or to realize that, yes, they need to take the time off. The challenges, interventions are not complete end to end, right? So like, now I know I need to take the time off. What do I do? What kind of help do I get? And then if I'm ready to go back to work, how do I know that I'm ready? And how do I make sure it doesn't happen again? Because that's part of the fear that comes with such a transition. And so to your question about what are the main challenges, I think one of the things I've noticed from the work I've done is we can't really predict what it's going to be like to go back to work. So
Very
just,
good. Yeah.
right, the example that you've taken 6 to 12 months off. How do you know what you can make assumptions about what it's going to be like to be back at work, but you never really know.
Exactly.
And so how do we anticipate scenarios? How do we prepare? And how do we do it in a way that's safe? Because the worst thing that can happen is that they go back to work, and then within a month or two, there's like this whiplash, and they realize, oh, I can't do this, and then I'm out of job. So when an employee is still attached to their employer, we really look at some of the technicalities of going back. Like, can you go back in smaller percentages? Can we adjust your responsibilities so that you can anticipate and sense how you're feeling, but there's time to course correct?
That's a very important one.
Adjust, right? And realize, okay, the full days don't really work, or this kind of work is really difficult for me at this point. There's time to course correct. Now, for individuals who are no longer attached to their employers and they're starting to find a new job, that's a little bit trickier. So we look at ways that we can simulate work while you're
Very good.
back at work, right? So are there volunteer activities? How do you start to build up working time in your day? But
And to establish a new rhythm, right? Because it's all about the daily schedule and to get that feeling again of what it feels like actually, right?
yes, and many of them will say that they're surprised how tired they are when they go back to work, understandably, because for
Which is
months,
normal.
sure, right? But it's good to know that it's almost expected that you will feel tired mentally and physically because you haven't been in that rhythm for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the challenges, just accepting that you can't predict, and how can we be open about it? How can we experiment, and how can we make it safe? And that's part of the work that we do.
That's also pointing to another important one. What you're saying is that it's totally individual and unique, right? The phenomenon. Now, if the viewers might have this question of, so what is the range of mental health breaks that are out there? You mentioned one example is burnout, but then there are many other facets. As you just described, it is very individual, and it's up to yourself to say, okay, I realize there's something in me, I need to take a break because, for example, might it be just that I feel I have too much information in my day and I need to take a break of just a month to have more time to settle all that information, that overwhelm.
I'm glad you say that, because I think this is a very new concept, I think, at least in the environment that we're operating in. I remember starting to hear this concept of I'm taking a mental health day. So it's a benefit that employees feel like I can just have a conversation with my manager and say, I'm not at my best today or this week, I'm going to take the time off.
Yeah.
But then for organizations, there's also the technical side of what's the policy around it? What's the consistency that you create around it? How do people know that they're eligible to take such a benefit? Because in more traditional organizations, or that maybe are a little bit less flexible, do we count this as a sick day? Do we count this as a vacation day, right? Like, how do you operationalize it?
Very important, because you need to put it in some sort of frame within the workplace, because otherwise anything is possible, and we have to define it a little bit on both sides, actually. Yeah.
I think it's really important to be able to define the guardrails around it while making people feel like they can take the time that they need. That is the other scenario, but we can look at other examples where maybe people experience some grief, or people experience a significant transition where they've moved to a new country and they're starting a new job. These kinds of events also have implications on well-being. So how can we be more open that it's not just about a diagnosis or about burnout, but really an ability for an organization to say, you have the time that you need to take care of yourself, and how can we support you so you remain productive and engaged to the organization as well.
And that's very strong, because that actually opens up, and it's a very large and open, flexible definition of mental health as a state of well-being where I am ready to take on challenges that the work brings with it. It's normal, but we have to be ready. And as you said, there might be just normal events in our lives. We all live lives, and in these lives there are unpredictable events. So we need to have that flexibility to allow for that to happen, and not to say, oh no, work is more important, you need to blank it out. And that was long time, that was the cultural expectation in many cultures, that we need to blank that out, and it has nothing to do at the workplace. The only thing that I knew from my prior workplaces was that we were allowed to have days off when somebody died.
Right.
But more than that didn't exist for many years, right?
Yeah, I also can only think of that as kind of the top of mind example, but we don't really have much more. And I think this is where there's an opportunity for organizations, if they really want to think about well-being as a systemic culture and way of working, is how do you integrate such concepts, right, and operationalize it? So because at the end of the day, we're all in here for productivity and engagement. That's what we want. And work is important to people, right? It's work is not just about the money anymore. It's a place of purpose and community. So I think it's interesting and aspirational to ask these questions. And I'm curious to see how we evolve, particularly in the corporate sector, to just elevate the conversations around this.
To elevate, and if I may add, to make them normal, to normalize them. It's part of our working world and part of our healthy working world. And as we become more conscious that it is really important to look after that constantly, and not just when people have a burnout, not just in the extremes, this normalization might create something of preventing these extremes, right? And I think that's what you're doing in your work, right? Are you not also helping people to normalize life again as...
Yeah, I think the more work that I do, particularly directly with organizations where they start to see, this is not just about prevention and training. There's a whole employee journey that they can influence around well-being, from preventing people from getting sick or feeling unwell, to also becoming a space where they're welcomed back, and they're welcomed back in a really supportive way.
And without any stigma as well, right? To welcome them back, but just let's carry on. It's normal. It's not something, oh my God, like it used to be, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And then you start to see like, hey, there are more conversations happening, there are more requests happening. Then you start to see that, okay, they've accepted that this is part of the reality. It's fine, it's valid, it's acknowledged. And here's what we can do about it. And that's really nice to see when you get to be a part of that journey with organizations where you see the shift, right? From where
that
you
is
start.
Excellent. Because so you are part, I mean, we are all part, but you are actively part of that movement to normalize it. And that's really laudable. Now, that leads us on nicely to the question, can you give us some more examples of how you help individuals and groups to transition back? You mentioned some of it already in terms of creating that rhythm, creating that time. What are the formats that you offer in your work?
So when I work directly with the individuals themselves, I use the concept of a return to work plan. And what I want to highlight here is, as much as we talk about going back to work, the work I do isn't just about the work. What I found is that when individuals come back from the recovery, there's also an identity shift that happens.
Ah, nice.
Like their values are shifting. If they get a diagnosis of something, there's something about how they view themselves and what their identity how it starts to evolve that's also happening. So you can't have simply a work conversation about when are you going back and what are you going to do, who are you going to talk to. You really have to look at, what does this experience of the absence and the recovery mean for you as a person,
as an identity, as you said.
As an identity, and who are you at this point in time? How do you show up? How do you introduce yourself? And that's, for me, the even more meaningful part of the work that I found is that when people come back from their mental health absence, there's also a shift in their identity that often takes. They start to view themselves a little bit differently. They're learning to integrate whatever learnings they've had through the recovery into how they want to live their lives in the future. And so a big chunk of the work that we do is unpacking that and making sure we know what's going to be different this time around. And how do you then apply that in the work setup, right? How do you introduce yourself as not exactly the same person to colleagues who knew you in a certain way?
Exactly, that's very important, because it might actually mean also, did you have those examples where people even realize it might mean a role shift, or maybe taking on less or more responsibilities?
I've had that a lot, especially among high performers and leaders, where they go back, they have to be honest and say, I don't really enjoy leading large teams. I really just want to do this type of work because that's what
that is important.
So how do they have that conversation without diminishing their self-worth and their value?
That is a very crucial point you just mentioned there, because it actually means this going into yourself and being self-honest is a very hard piece to say, okay, I have this long-standing experience of leading a large team, but I have to be self-honest. I won't be doing, but it doesn't mean that my self-worth is going down, and that how to communicate that is so important.
Yes, and ideally, my hope is that they always have, supportive leaders that they have this conversation with, where they don't feel that they're suffering a consequence because of that change. I've had clients also who, had really successful corporate careers and then transitioned to more creative freelancing type of work. That's a massive decision and identity shift that they're having to process. And so how do they stay whole and confident and secure in themselves as they make those decisions of what's good for them moving forward? So there's a lot of that work that, that I also try to make them feel safe to have.
The making feel safe thingy. And would it be fair to say, to paraphrase your work, that what you're actually doing is to help people have the courage to reinvent themselves?
Yeah, I love that actually, because in many cases it is a reinvention that they're having to go through. Absolutely.
And that is beautiful, isn't it? Because we should have all the courage and also the liberty and the freedom to do that in our lives, because we only have one life. We can't just say, oh, in my next life, I will be a jewelry expert. I can't do that because I only have one life.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many different levels and intensities of reinvention. And what I love to see is when they're part of organizations that give them that space to say, okay, you don't want to be a leader anymore. Great. We still value you as a technical expert, and we have that space for you. And that
is beautiful. Yeah. That actually leads us to the question, what would you recommend now? People who are listening, who are part of larger or small organizations, doesn't matter the size, but of organizations who want that be part of their culture. What do you recommend them? How do you create such a space that gives people the safety and the freedom to talk openly about that without having that feeling of guilt, or even, as you said, the self-diminishing feeling and fear of that, and then again, it becoming a taboo?
I think it's such an important question, and it's a hard one, I have to admit, because when leaders come to me and say, like, how do I implement strategies, for example, or what should I do as a leader to make sure my team, feels well? I have to talk about them first. Why is this important to you as a leader? Because it's easy to come up with interventions and activities and initiatives that you don't maybe necessarily deeply believe in. So, how do they view mental health? What are their beliefs and biases and fears around talking about mental health in the workplace? And one of the biggest fears is, I know nothing about it. I'm not an expert. I'm not a therapist. Like, you don't need to. I think what's most important for leaders to understand is they actually have a lot of influence on workplace well-being just because of the way work is designed and organized.
And how the design, the organization around it, and how they talk about it, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And they think that the mental health conversation is, how are you feeling today? What can I do for you?
That's a bias. It's not. Yeah.
It's not. I think a good well-being conversation could just begin with, how are you feeling about your workload this month or this week? What do you need to do your best job, or what's getting in your way of doing your best job? That already can open up a conversation that tells a leader what's important for their employees, and then they can figure out a way to resolve anything that's getting in the way. Or, do you have the support that you need to deal with the stress you're experiencing?
Oh, very good question. Yeah. And that breaks as well the stigma. What you're just saying there is, it breaks as well the stigma, because the stigma is that when you talk about mental health, people think we're moving into this fluffy area of talking about how do you feel in general. No. It's not about getting into people's private life, but that's a stigma. And it's also not about employing 10 psychologists to be part of. No, psychologists are important. I'm one of them, but it is not something, as you just said, the bias is also where you say, no, leave that to the mental health experts. No. It is, as you say, a very normal conversation is, do you have all the support you need? How do you feel about your work? That is the question.
Yes. And I think for leaders to feel empowered that they can do something about it, because many leaders would share, I don't even want to bring it up because I don't know what to do with what they're going to say.
Yeah, and that's, again, creating the taboo. Once you avoid a topic, not good, because then you give the example of, let's rather not talk about it here, and then people will talk about it where? In the breaks, in the off-site, and they will say, oh, our leader, she doesn't really want to talk about this. What a bad environment. And then the whole taboo starts to kick in again.
So I think you're absolutely right in that if we really want to think about what leaders can do, how do we talk about well-being and mental health more from a this is how we want to work together, this is our culture, this is our way of working, rather than as the technicality of, is there a diagnosis? Of course, that's
Yeah,
important to say, but we don't expect leaders to necessarily know that or be experts at.
exactly.
We broaden up the conversation to say we all play a part in how we influence each other's well-being. And if we just ask each other these simple questions,
Yeah, it
opens
starts with
up
that, very small.
right there. And then you don't really have to worry about anything else after
And
that.
I think your job, your work is really doing a huge contribution to that, as we said before, normalizing it, making it into smaller steps. Small questions can do a huge impact rather than waiting until everything explodes and maybe 5 people of the team drop into burnout or whatever, and then they need medical attention. And we are actually talking about that mental health as something positive. It's the daily self-care, right? So that is part of our modern working culture, I guess.
Yeah, it should be, right? I think it should be. It's about people feeling good about themselves. It's people feeling valued. It's going back to the basics, right? Like we just all want to feel acknowledged. We want to feel valued. We know we want to feel like we belong and that we're safe.
Exactly. And that kind of space to have that conversation could start with, and we had that in a previous conversation on PowerMinds, it could start with setting the space just 2 minutes in every meeting to say, okay, we have that space. It's not something to be avoided. You know, if people feel, oh, I'm really worried that I will have the support for that project because I have 2 parallel projects and the one is kind of overlapping with the other, can somebody help me out on that? That I can ask for that. That should be, you know, these 2 minutes we should have.
Right. And I've seen that work really well. Also, when I was still working in corporate, where you did have that space at the start of every meeting to just check in without any desire or need to problem solve.
Yeah,
Just be able to
exactly.
express it and feel like it's
Exactly.
okay that I've said it and now it's out there and now I can do something about it. Right. And so
Because, yeah, sorry.
no, I was
I
just
let you
thinking, I think
finish
we
first.
can simplify it. I think there's opportunity to simplify it, to make it more meaningful and sustainable, and avoid the feeling like we need these big interventions and trainings and things that are one-off that don't really have a long-term impact. So
Yeah,
that's
because you
yeah.
just mentioned, if I may underline your final point as well, you mentioned a huge, I call that barrier of even speaking about a topic in corporate life is usually that people are fearful of, oh, if I say this, it will become an issue of problem solving, as you said, or it will become a huge next project. And people don't want that, so they don't mention it.
Right.
So if you create that space where you say, no, let's just say small things and we don't have to problem solve anything. It's just give space to voice things,
Yeah.
you know, without having that fear of, oh, if I say that, then I will be asked to do another project.
Right. Exactly. That's often the fear, and it happens, right? You bring it up, you then do something about it, and that might not there are cases where that's the right thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean by default that it's the
Yeah.
right thing to do. So yeah, I think there are many opportunities here. I understand, having worked also in HR, that this is a complex topic, so it's not something that you can just solve for overnight, and that
Yeah.
there's this perfect solution out there. My goal is to just generate the conversations, to provoke the reflection, and take it a step at a time, right? Pick one space to start with and then go from there.
And that is wonderful. I will provide your contact on LinkedIn. So dear viewers, if you got interested, please feel free to contact Karina. Thank you so much, Karina, for your time today and for this lovely interview. Thank you.
Alex, I enjoyed the conversation as well, and I appreciate having a chance to talk